what I wanted to just do in the time that I have is explain a little bit about the issue of women in war and why it became something that I felt was very interesting and that also I wanted to write about. And I wrote a book, well, getting on for 10 years ago, where I interviewed a number of people involved in different wars, sometimes directly in the Second World War, and also people who campaigned against wars subsequently. And it made me think a lot about this issue of women and war. And I wanted to just spell out a few things, because if you think about the impact of war on women, it's always impacted. I mean, you think of you can go back to the Trojan War, the huge effects it had on women, the way in which particularly they were treated in a very brutal way, raped and so on. But that, of course, didn't stop with the Trojan War. It's still with us today. It's a common weapon of warfare. But of course, women have always suffered death, the need to move, loss of loved ones and so on. But I think when you look at the 20th century and now the 21st century as well, you see a very different picture. And I suppose I'll put it like this, that in the 20th century, we've seen more and more war becoming total war. In other words, it's not just confined to one small part of one country or maybe 2 or 3 countries. It's something which really has embraced the whole of the world in very, very direct ways. And of course, as that has become the case, it has become warfare has become something which isn't just between 2 armies or a set piece battle. It's become something which increasingly involves civilians. And of course, now the victims of warfare today in the 21st century, civilian victims of warfare vastly outnumber military victims of warfare, and will continue to do so, because the technology, unfortunately, is used to devise more and more weapons of mass destruction, which often are operated by people remotely. They use drones and all this kind of thing. And of course, the people who suffer are the people who live in the particular regions that are being attacked. So this has meant much greater direct involvement of women in war as victims, in terms of refugees, as people who've been killed or injured, people who've suffered sexual assault and all these different kinds of things. But also it's had another effect, I think, which is that particularly during the First and Second World Wars, the whole nature of this total war actually began to transform women's lives, in the sense that they became involved in working in munitions factories, or as nurses, or as sometimes directly in the military. And this was a different pattern for them. And that, of course, meant they had very direct experience of war in the way that hadn't been the case for most of the time. And of course, if you look at the last century, Eric Hobsbawm, the great historian who wrote his Age of Extremes, he talks about the short 20th century, which he dated as from 1914, the beginning of the First World War, to 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He estimates that 187 million people died as a result of wars in those times. I think it's generally estimated, and this is killed directly in war, or including things like the mass killing of civilians and the concentration camps and all these kind of things. I think 60 million alone in the Second World War. I think it's fair to say that any future world war will have even more devastating consequences in all sorts of ways. And I think that one of the effects of this has been that while women have become more involved directly in war, both as participants and as people who contributed towards war efforts and defense and all this kind of thing, there's also become a great deal more awareness of how deadly war is. And one of the people I interviewed described the present widespread opposition to war which exists in public opinion in Britain and many other parts of the world. And she said that actually it's the women's view of war has now become society's view of war. In other words, that it is wrong, that it shouldn't be happening. And I think the turning point of that was very much the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, because people saw that this is an end of this dreadful war. But how does it end? It ends with even more weapons of destruction that previously had been unimagined, and with huge numbers of deaths in Japan. So if you look at that pattern since then, if you look at the 1950s, you have the growth of CND, lots of women always involved in CND, perhaps counterintuitively if you compare it to sort of mainstream politics at the time, you know, in Parliament and so on. And of course, we had movements against the Vietnam War. We've had all sorts of the resurgence of CND again in the 80s, when we had cruise missiles and the Green and Common Camp and all those sorts of things. Women have played an increasingly important role in opposing war. And it seems to me today that this kind of all women's panel is obviously well chosen, but it's not particularly accidental, in the sense that it's this reflects a great deal of concern and involvement to do with women opposing war. And again, this is something which isn't new, but it's quite different from how people perhaps imagine discussions of war and peace maybe 50 or 60 years ago. And just in terms of the involvement that I've had in the war on terror, in opposing the war on terror, I have to say, and the wars since the 2001, with the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and since then we've had Syria, Libya, we now have a war in Ukraine. The wars aren't going away. Yemen, there's all these, there's a conflict again on the between Iraq and Turkey now over recent bombing in Iraqi Kurdistan. All these things are going on. And I think it's very important that we continue this opposition to it, but also we recognize the very important role of women play in this. And it's sometimes easy to forget this when you look at, you know, the candidates for the Tory party leadership. We have Liz Truss, who's promising us a big increase in so-called defence spending. We had Penny Mordaunt, who was a former member of the armed forces. But actually, this isn't the common view of women. And I particularly feel that over the last 20 or so years, we've had the development of very big movements of men and women, but women playing a very prominent role. I'd like to just highlight there the role of Muslim women, who are very much identified as sort of passive and unable to kind of take political action independently. That's been exactly the opposite experience to, I think, the one that we had in the anti-war movement, when they played an incredibly prominent, important, active role. And I would say the reason there are now Muslim women MPs, and that there are now women playing more prominent role, Muslim women playing a prominent role, I think it has a lot to do with the way in which those stereotypes were broken as part of the campaigning over the Iraq War. We had school students, again, many women who played a key role in this. We've had trade unionist women who played a very key role. So I think all of these are things that we look at it, that this is now part of the fabric of politics in this country. And just to conclude, because I guess I've coming up to my time now, Carol, but just to conclude on this, I think this stands in great contrast to the way in which mainstream politics regards these questions, where there's pretty much most of the time, there's a very high level of sort of political consensus over wars and the idea you have to get behind wars. And I think that women staying active in political organizations, in organizations that campaign against wars, in doing all those sorts of things, is vitally important to put across this message that there is not, that nothing good is going to come out of these wars. These are wars which are fought by the rich and powerful, who want to protect their interests, and they allow the poor to suffer as a result of them. So I think by talking about women and war and nuclear weapons, we're talking about a different narrative, and one that it's very, very important for us to put across. So I'll end it there and look forward to hearing the discussion. Thanks, Carol.